Should I go ahead? Welcome. Welcome to the EECS Colloquium. Our speaker today is Alan Kay. I ran into Alan last July on some flight, and the guy sitting next to me was reading this book on constrained logic programming, and I said, sounds like a computer scientist. And then I looked at him and I said, Alan, gosh, where have you been for so many years? And he opened up his notebook and showed me so many cool things on it, and I'm saying, wow. I said, you've got to come to MIT and give a talk on this stuff. He says, but I don't want to talk to researchers. I only want to talk to young people, you know, who are ready for new ideas. And I'm sure you're going to see lots of them today. I keep running into Alan. First time I heard him was, gosh, I think 25 years ago. And I had heard of Smalltalk, and I thought he was going to come and give a talk on Smalltalk. And this was in California somewhere. And then he came and talked about this notebook-sized computer, which was going to revolutionize the whole world. And it sounded so crazy. I mean, mini computers hardly existed at that time. And he's talking of a computer that you'll carry with you everywhere, and you know, all the information you want will be on it. You'll be reading novels on it in your bed, you know, and so on. So I think it's fair to say that he's really one of the iconoclasts in this field. Alan has been at many places. He studied at Utah. He taught at Stanford, and his association with MIT has been long, with Artificial Intelligence Lab as well as with the Media Lab. He joined, what was it, PARC, Xerox PARC. That's where Dynabook stuff and Smalltalk stuff was done. After that, I think he spent some time at Atari, and then he became a fellow at Apple, where lots of very interesting things were done. And he was at Apple until very recently. And in the last couple of years ago, he moved to Disney. So we'll hear from Alan Kay today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, I have a little thing I have to do. You know how they, in the middle of a baseball game, for no reason, they say all the rights to this baseball game you're watching are owned by somebody, and you mustn't do this or that under pain of death. And this is actually the opposite one. They asked me to sign a releasing to MIT the copyright of this talk, and I said, no, I'm willing to give you the talk, but I don't want to cede you the copyright. And this is because back in the old days, especially here at MIT, this was one of the great places for turning government money into public domain knowledge. So that was the basic idea, is to get the knowledge out, particularly in science, where we have to have lots of people working on the problems, especially if the problems are difficult. And this is an official announcement that I give MIT the tapes that they're taping today, but I don't give them the copyright. So, as Arvind mentioned, we just happened to be on the same plane together, and I was doing some stuff in a system that we started at Apple and have been working on at Disney, and now with several thousand people around the internet, and he wanted me to come here and show it. But I didn't want to come and just give a demo, so I thought I'd try and put some context to it and talk about where the computer revolution is right now. And there are lots of different places of starting this, but here's a fellow I ran into when I went to graduate school. Very shadowy figure. In fact, that isn't actually a photograph of him. So we were quite sure that if you were to point a camera at him, it wouldn't register an image. So Bob Barton was probably the greatest computer designer who ever lived. And he was 6'4", big, burly guy with a childlike face, and the kind of guy who could win both push-up contests and beer drinking contests with Australians. And he was kind of a left-wing William F. Buckley. that he was incredibly eloquent, and he was very, very grumpy. In fact, he was did not consider himself to be a professor. He had just been invited to Utah for a year by the head of the department, Dave Evans. And so he consulted at Burroughs while he was doing this stuff. And so pretty much the first course I ever took in graduate school was called Advanced Systems Programming. And here's what he said the first day. He said, "There are a few things known about systems design, and most of them are written down. I expect you to read and learn them thoroughly. However, my job is to firmly disabuse you of any fondly held notions that you might have brought into this classroom." And thus followed one of the greatest semesters I ever spent in school, because in spite of the fact that he said he didn't like graduate students, and it was hard to tell exactly whether he was kidding or not, what he did do was pay us a tremendous compliment, which was he assumed we could learn everything that was known by just reading all of the papers. And he gave us this immense long reading list. And he realized that the best thing he could do for us was to not debug us, because that would imply putting his opinions into us, but simply to expose all of our flaws. And that's what he did. And you're very lucky when you have a professor who will do this. So no matter what we thought had to be an eternal truth in computing or in anything else, this guy could argue us out of it in 2 seconds. And the next day we come in with a better one. And for a while we played a guessing game of what does this guy want us to say. But he was much smarter than that. We never found out. And at the end of the semester, those of us who survived were basically free, in the sense that there was nothing sacred about anything any company or any academic institution was doing in computers that wasn't open to question and one couldn't go back and start simply from scratch. Now, obviously, that's not the purpose of a 1-hour talk here. Can't do that. But I think it's worthwhile to occasionally call in to question things that are so pervasive that they seem to be completely true. Now, Bob particularly hated IBM for many, many reasons, but not the least of which was that their pervasiveness and efficiency made people of lesser wit think that IBM must be the only way to do things. And he just really hated this. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is say a few things about creativity, a couple of things about what we thought we were doing when we were trying to invent personal computing and new ways to program, and then show you some examples, and then also to give, at the very end, to give you a kind of a gift. So on creativity, there are lots of different ways of thinking about it. But I like Arthur Koestler's version. He says, human thought processes are kind of like an ant walking on a plane. That plane is basically context or our beliefs. We believe that what's on the plane is everything there is. And we can have all kinds of illusions of progress. We can go forward, we can go back, we can choose goals, we can get to them, we can get around obstacles. So we can do all of the paraphernalia of thinking. But in fact, as Koestler points out, everything we're doing is pink. And every once in a while, we have a blue idea. But we've got parents. Some of us have gone to church. We go to school. We live in a town, a state, a country, a world. And away goes the blue idea. But every once in a while, when we're waking up, when we're out running, taking a shower, in an unguarded moment, a blue idea bursts forth, something completely new. And the technical term for how you feel is holy shit. This idea is so good, so new, so delivered from the heavens that it seems like it must be true. And in fact, in the old days, people would, when they had an idea like this, they'd go out and start a religion. Nowadays, lots of people still do, especially in business. But here's the thing about ideas. Most ideas, at their best, are mediocre. And most ideas, in fact, are bad. And you can imagine why. Just like getting up to the top of a mountain. There's probably 5 or 6 ways to get up there, but there are a billion ways not to get up there. It's just so hard to get to a good place and so easy to get to a bad place. So if you're a scientist, what you do is realize that you're an artist in an art form that requires you to submit your ideas back to nature as the main critic. And that little difference in how we judge our ideas has made an enormous difference in civilization in the last 400 years. Now, Kessler also pointed out that there's emotional reactions connected to these ideas. So he says if you're telling a joke to somebody, the reaction is ha-ha. If you're doing science, it's a ha. And if you're doing art, it's ah. And you can sort of see why, because what's a joke but leading somebody down a garden path in one context and then suddenly you're revealing it's about something else. Science, not only do you get the aha, but often, as everybody in this room has probably had the experience at least once, when you see it, you often start laughing. Because nature has a way of being right in front of us, except we just can't see. We're sorting on the wrong criteria. And it's kind of like a joke when you finally see something that's there that you didn't see before. And art, especially high art's job is to remind us that there are other contexts. That's the whole point of it. Because as humans, we have this tendency of making basically the sub-goals be the goal. We all know that. You work on a programming system for a couple of years, and all of a sudden you forget why did you start it in the first place. What you're really trying to do, you find, is your religion has now become making the garbage collector better. But the users that you're originally going to make the programming system for, you can't even remember who they were. So, art. And then there's an interesting connection between learning and creativity, which is that it's almost as creative an act to learn something new as it was to think it up in the first place. We don't have to be quite as creative as Newton to learn calculus, but we have to do something to our brain. We have to become a different kind of person in order to deal with that idea. And so there's an interesting intertwining. I think most schools have a very difficult time with this notion. Most schools think they're just loading knowledge stuff into the dump truck that's our mind. And when education's working well, it actually changes the vehicle that we are. And here's the thing that's really a tough deal in a technical school, an engineering school, which is learning about all that other stuff too. Engineers tend to like to optimize, and I'm glad they do. So you never want to fly in a plane that was designed by a scientist. They're just as happy if it crashes. Maybe happier. So there's certain situations where you want the people dealing with the outside world to stay in the pink plane and just optimize the hell out of it. But for lots of things, it really helps to know about have other knowledge that you can draw on as a way of finding analogies and escaping from the pink plane you're in and into some other system of thought that might help you better. And so I think that there's this crossroads where occasionally something comes along. I'm going to show you a couple of them that I call idealets, where you don't actually have the epiphany right away. You're presented with an enigma, something that you're trying to learn, and the question that the environment is asking you in a funny way is this thing you're trying to learn a better new thing, a better old thing? Is it like what you've been doing right now and it's kind of an optimization, or is it almost a new thing? And in business, the experience I've had working with business people is almost everything they want it to be a better old thing. And in fact, if you go out and do market surveys to the American public in general, and you ask them what do you want, and pretty much the answer comes back as they want pretty much what they have now, except 10% better, 10% cheaper, 10% more features. And so marketing people really don't have as part of their brief to leave people better than they found them. Their interest is in who are people and what do they want. And so the tendency is to do a lot of pink plane surfing. That would be okay if we didn't have mass manufacturing, because that allows us to take these simple-minded improvements in various ways and absolutely saturate the landscape with them to the extent where it's very hard for anybody to have a new idea. So I think ultimately this is not good. Now, I started programming in the early 60s, 61 and 62, and I think everybody here knows that the computers back then were physically large and logically small. They were tiny little things. My first computer had 8K bytes. Second one had about 10K bytes. So you couldn't do much, and as a result, most programs were successful. And it tended to be algorithmic. The way people learned to program was to learn an algorithm for this and an algorithm for this and 5 sorting algorithms and so forth. And yes, there were bugs, but in fact, they were so simple that, and the core dumps were so small that you could actually get the programs going. So I liken that to being able to make a doghouse out of almost anything except maybe cobwebs without having to know anything about structural engineering. Most materials are just so strong that the person who's making the doghouse could be a 5-year-old kid almost. And the programming back then had this aspect of clockwork. And there's a connection of the clockwork with the way mathematics seems to work to most people. And I think everybody here is aware that a lot of what computers were used for outside of business were doing various kinds of numerical methods. And so there were a lot of mathematicians who were sort of half and half between math and this new stuff that came along. So algorithm intensive, very clockwork in its outlook. And because the computers were small, you could make clocks that would work. Now, when I got to graduate school, Dave Evans, before you could even find your desk to sit down, he gave you Ivan Sutherland's thesis, which had been published in 1963. He did his work out at Lincoln Labs. And this is the invention of computer graphics and a few other things. So he had not only computer graphics, but he controlled them by means of graphical constraints. So this is the first system to really have icons that stood for meanings of things. You sketched things and told the system what the further rules were on the sketches, and often it could figure it out. It could solve nonlinear problems in real time. Really an incredible system. And amazingly, it had programming structures that we would call almost object-oriented today. It even had a kind of a hierarchy of classes, which were called masters back then. And this is a drawing of a sketchpad object from Ivan's thesis. And here is the entry, 6 or so words down, for the display routine. And in here is a pointer to the subroutine. And in true object-oriented fashion, every type of thing in Sketchpad had a pointer to a routine that would display it, but the display routines were different. So points were displayed in a different way of lines, and larger aggregate structures knew to cycle through their parts and so forth. So we would call this a very modern technique. And you can imagine what it was like. It's programmed, by the way, in a macro assembler. And you can imagine what it was like to read this in 1966, or maybe you can't. But it was almost incomprehensible, except kind of what it did. The reason we could tell what it did is it was full of drawings that it had made itself, thus setting a really tough act to follow. In fact, it's one of the few theses on graphics where the graphic system was actually strong enough to illustrate itself. So as Tony Hoare said about Algol, that Sketchpad was a vast improvement on its successors. So when I did find my desk, I found a pile of tapes and listings and a little sign saying, "This doesn't work, make it work." Basically, they thought what this thing was the Algol for the UNIVAC 1108, and it happened to be Simula for the UNIVAC 1107. And of course, those machines weren't really compatible. And the Simula had been doctored onto this earlier Algol done at Case Western Reserve. So my job, I discovered at Utah they had, I don't know if they do this at MIT anymore, but at Utah they had an interesting hazing routine, which is the dirtiest task that none of the existing graduate students wanted to do would be loaded on the next new graduate student coming in there. So it was kind of a puberty rite of getting this thing going. But the other graduate students were friendly, and so we used a wonderful media technique, which is very hard to do today, which is we took these fanfold listings and unraveled them all the way down the corridor of Merrill Engineering Building. And 4 of us graduate students crawled around on these machine code listings, yelling out things to each other. Now, imagine trying to do this on your fancy machines today. But it's actually very good, because you're following this, and the other guy was following this, and you could say, "Hey, did you see what, yeah, look at this over here." So after about 2 weeks of crawling around on this thing, we finally understood what the storage allocator was doing, and we realized that what Simula was doing was allocating not Algol-like structures, but it was allocating structures very much like what Sketchpad allocated. That is, independent modules whose, and you might have thought, well, why didn't you read the documentation? And we tried. But it was actually literally Norwegian transliterated into English word for word. And they actually used words that we thought we knew the meaning of, but they had given them different reference. So it was easier to actually look at the code to see what it did. And so Simula presented one of these crossroads. It was definitely, from their standpoint, it was definitely a better Algol. They had designed this thing to be able to simulate complex, discrete event systems like oil refineries, where you'd have thousands and thousands of valves. And they had a thing like what we call a class structure. And they could definitely allocate instances, thousands of them. And so it was this really interesting entity, and it was, in a way, more powerful than Sketchpad in the sense that Sketchpad couldn't solve all the problems that you wanted to do, and it didn't have even a weak way of dealing with problems that you didn't want to, that you were trying to do that it didn't have mechanism for. But Simula just had a full-blown programming language behind it, so you could pretty much do anything. It just didn't come out looking as nice as the things that did work in Sketchpad. So this was the crossroads, and it just happened that one of my undergraduate degrees was in molecular biology. And I had read this book the year before, in '65, by James Watson, Molecular Biology of the Gene. Really a great book. It's in its umpty-umpth edition now. But one of the many fantastic things that this book had in it was the first actual assay of a living creature. And because they loved E. coli, it was the favorite bacterium back then, they especially loved these T4 phage viruses that attacked E. coli. You could find out a lot about E. coli by doing things with the phage viruses. They had actually learned a lot about what was actually inside there from a whole bunch of different angles. So, for instance, I knew that E. coli had about 3,000 kinds of protein. And I knew it had about 120 million large molecules that interacted with each other informationally. I knew that this interaction happened rapidly, really rapidly. In fact, these popcorn-looking things here, if the atoms in them were the size of a tennis ball, they'd be about the size of a Volkswagen. And these, if we were down at that scale, like this guy is right here, looking at this thing is actually moving its own length in 2 nanoseconds. Now, how fast is that scale speed to the person that size standing there? You can compute it out. How fast does light go in a nanosecond? I mean, how far does light go in a nanosecond? About a foot. So the Volkswagen is 8 feet long, and it goes its own length in 2 nanoseconds. So how fast is it traveling scale speed? 4 times the speed of light. And this is one of the problems with the way they teach chemistry these days, is they rarely give students a sense of what is actually going on down there. It's violent. In fact, you have to kill the bacterium and stop it dead in order to see anything. Just a complete blur in them. And there are wonderful things, like these guys are rotating at 1 million revolutions per second. Million per second. These lipid molecules in the cell membrane are actually a kind of a fluid in 2 of the dimensions. So they're exchanging places with each other 10 million times a second, and they randomly float. If you were to see this thing, the actual thing we think of the skin is actually interchanging all of the things, and the lipid molecule that's up here will be down here a half second later, just by diffusing around. So this is like nothing we've ever thought about. It's certainly not like a clock. Nothing like a clock. And they had also found out enough about the DNA of this guy to realize, in today's terms, it has about a megabyte of DNA. And the DNA is about 1,000 times as long as the cell. Just one last diversion here, but does anybody happen to know, if we take a single cell in our body and we strung the DNA together, how long it would actually be? 2 meters. 6 feet long in each cell. Just unbelievable. So then another holy shit is that E. coli is 1/2000th the volume of the typical cells in our body, and we have somewhere between 10 to 100 trillion of these. So these guys have 10,000 different proteins, 10 billion of them in each cell. And yet 50 cell divisions is all it takes to make a baby. In fact, if you work it out, it's only 40. And I'll leave it up to you to think, while I'm giving this talk, what the extra 10 cell divisions are actually used for. So I was really lucky. There's nothing like luck when you're trying to have an idea. It's better than anything. There I was, looking at Simula, trying to figure out what the hell this thing was, all these things going around, and then all of a sudden I realized, oh yeah, Simula is a language that's trying to be like biology, but it isn't. But it's trying. Because if you really went a little further in the biological thing, you start getting these wonderful things about it. And furthermore, it's recursive to the hardware of the machine in a way that is really marvelous. Bob Barton always used to say, basic idea of recursion is make the parts have the same power as the wholes. Now, if the whole is a computer, how can you possibly claim that a data structure has the same power as a computer? It doesn't. How can you claim that a procedure has the same power as a computer? It doesn't. And again, this is one of these things where you realize, oh yeah, these mathematicians in the 40s and 50s, they didn't know what they were doing. They thought functions and sets were the way to do this, but the computer is a more important idea than functions and sets. It's this whole thing, and in fact, here at Project Mac and out at Berkeley, people were starting to make what were called virtual machines, a little different than today's terminology, but the idea was to give each person on a time-sharing system a logical machine that acted, and you might have 100 of them for 100 users. And I was thinking, yeah, that's a really great idea, except we need hundreds of thousands of these things, because then we can model anything that we want. And you get this wonderful thing, just like from the same stuff, there are hundreds of different kinds of tissues in our body, all from the same DNA and the same basic stuff. And then there's this insight that, yeah, and you can even model programming language things. You can step out away from the compiler and actually simulate programming language ideas. DNA, but computers, you can pull the DNA out, like Simula was doing with its classes, and that's really powerful. And then here's an idea that was, I ascribe it, I don't know where exactly, but I certainly think of Peter Deutsch's PDP-1 Lisp done here at MIT when he was only 15 as an example, because this was a system that had no operating system. It was just a Lisp, interactive Lisp, and he had fixed it up so you could control the entire machine. And what a great idea. Because what is an operating system anyway except something you can't fix when you need to? And when you do fix it, you have to fix it with a programming language. And Peter had just cut out the middleman there. And the late binding structure of Lisp made it possible to do this on the fly. I think he was the first one to do that. That's kind of like this notion that DNA actually doesn't do much by itself. DNA, and a lot of viruses are almost naked DNA, but they need a cell to know how to make another cell. This is the most interesting part of biology, I think, which is what's called morphogenesis, or embryogenesis, which is how do you get from something that is only coding for proteins, 60,000 proteins in our case, to something that's like a baby? And the answer is you have to have something else, which is a set of structures and a place for sending messages that allow that to happen. And that led to this idea that if you extend complexity out far enough, at some point we'll have to start growing software. That is, we won't, like in the simplest case, we won't want to ever build a system from compiling word processor files and making a load module. Now people, I think most people would love not to do that anyway right now, because as you get more and more complex, just things like the initialization problems and getting everything set up and linked together is such an incredible thing. You really want to start with something that's already working and just make it incredibly better over and over again. So that led to a sort of a first pass, which we call Flex, and since nobody ever does anything just for beauty, this Flex language came out as a reaction to a project that I got involved with, which is to build a little desktop computer with my friend Ed Cheadle. And that's what it looked like. That's actually a picture from its own display. And it had kind of an object-oriented version of what Peter Deutsch had done, and it had Windows. Was far from the first system with Windows. Sketchpad had a window. It was one of the first with multiple windows, and it had a semi-graphical interface. And it was a desktop computer for very special desks, namely those made out of steel. So it weighed about 400 pounds. And see, the thing is that the integrated circuits back then were so small. They only had, in fact, you can look on this chart here. See that back in 1967, there was maybe a couple of hundred elements on an integrated circuit, and we built that machine because there was a rumor of a 512-bit ROM that General Instruments was going to make. But we also knew about Moore's writings. He started writing in '65, and we had a lot of faith that what he said was going to happen. If you're interested, this is Moore's original graph plotted out where he said it's going to be a factor of 2 every year. And later, he said, well, it's not going to be worse than a factor of 2 every 2 years. That's that plot. And here's what happened to RAM up until now. So that's pretty good. It's about as good as having Jupiter be where it's supposed to be after 7 years voyage. And it's interesting that DEC and IBM knew all about this, but thought that that would give them more margins on their mainframes. That's sort of pink thinking. Then, pretty much 30 years ago to the day, right now, I came out here because I'd heard from Marvin Minsky about Seymour Papert and what he was doing with children. I went out to Bridge School and saw that what Seymour was doing, he wasn't just fooling around with the kids. He wasn't just giving them games to do. He was actually teaching them advanced mathematics in a way that was really fun for them. And one of the typical programs in Logo back then was to make a circle repeat over and over again, go a little and turn a little. And I think everybody here is supposed to take enough math to realize that that's the differential equation of a circle in curvature coordinates or inertial coordinates. In fact, what he's saying here is the curvature of this is some constant. And if you have a constant curvature, you're always going to get a circle. And Jesus, that's unbelievable. And so here were the kids picking those numbers and getting the little turtle to do this. This completely blew my mind. And going back on the plane to Utah, I started sketching this machine because I was thinking, this is the best, what Seymour was doing is the best idea that anybody's had this half century. Because he realizes there's something special about the computer that's connected with thinking. And the way to get that something special out to the general world is not to try and teach adults that, because they will be too recalcitrant. They'll try and turn it back into pink things, like paper documents. But what Seymour was doing is realizing, yeah, but the way to do this is teach the powerful ideas to the kids, and you might cut out 100 years of bumbling towards what this new set of ideas is. And this just absolutely blew my mind. I've been working on Danny Barbaro once said the dues we have to pay for having fun with computers is that we have to work on our first big project for the rest of our life. Now, because I also liked history, I knew something interesting about the last time a medium like this appeared, and that is that there were 371 handwritten manuscripts in the Vatican Library in 1400. That was one of the largest libraries in Europe. How do I know it was 371? Because you can count 371 things reliably. There were so few of them. Gutenberg, and they cost millions of bucks a piece in today's money. Gutenberg came along, $60,000. So in the way I was thinking of it, oh yeah, that's kind of a workstation. That's like my flex machine thing. And then Aldous, 50 years later, around 1495 to 1500, came up with a little book. Why is it this size? Same size that books are today. It's unbelievable that the size of books hasn't changed. And that's because the size that books are today is the size that saddlebags were in Venice in the year 1495, because Aldous actually went out and measured them. Because the first 40 books he published from his press were called the Portable Library. And they were not about religion like the Gutenberg Bible was, but they were about philosophy. But then something unusual happened, that the result of this revolution didn't start to bear fruit for hundreds of years. It wasn't really until the 17th century that we see it bearing fruit in science, and to the 18th century in politics. And that is a long lag. And so the thing that several of us thought about in the 60s was, wow, we're going to be able to get through this stage also in 50 years. Moore's law says we can do a Dynabook before the year 2000. In fact, we thought we'd be able to do it before the year 1985. And the question is are we going to have to wait another 100 or 200 years for the fruits of these new ways of thinking to actually spread out into the general population? And the thought was, wow, let's really pay attention to what Seymour is saying and see if we can get it out earlier. So Xerox PARC came along just at the right time. ARPA funding had gotten muzzled because of the Mansfield Amendment. And so Taylor skimmed off a lot of people from the ARPA projects around, and this was a proposal to try and work on a machine that looked kind of like this. And there's a big problem. Now we're talking about, we're not just talking about a little machine for kids, we're talking about something cosmic, something big. The ARPANET was being worked on back then. And there's this huge problem, which is nobody knew how to build scalable software, or indeed scalable almost anything else, except it looked like the ARPANET was going to scale. And it looked like it was going to scale because it had a message passing architecture, just as the nascent object systems that we're working on. And we had this really good set of examples of the difference between something like System 360. Now nowadays you'd fill in Windows 98 or almost any piece of Microsoft software. But basically, well, that's like getting applauded for saying the devil is not nice.
Amen.
Nothing controversial there. But the thing is that all of these software systems done by hand tools and weak ideas tend to resemble pyramids. That is, they're big garbage dumps that somebody has plastered over with limestone. And we had some wonderful examples. I was a big fan of building complex structures, so I knew that the Empire State Building had actually been physically fabricated in less than 11 months by less than 3,000 people. I also knew the Empire State Building, from the time they decided to do it to the time they occupied the building, was less than 20 months. Okay, and when I thought about that, I was thinking, gee whiz, we couldn't organize 30 people, 300 people, or 3,000 people to do anything of any complexity in software if somebody held a gun to our head. We just don't have the way of doing it. And so this is when, these kind of situations are when late binding starts becoming a more and more important idea. And if you think about it, almost every advance in software has been a kind of late binding. And I believe this statement is just as true today as it was back then, and that is we just don't know enough. We don't have an engineering discipline. And so even when we're doing something that looks like the project that we did the last time, it turns out to have a huge learning curve. And the problem is, if we're using an early bound system, back in the old days like ALGOL or Fortran or COBOL or machine code, nowadays like C or C++, just as you start learning something, the system has gotten too rigid to be reformulated. So you say, no, we have to get the deadline done. Let's leave those ideas until later. Do those ideas ever get in? Forget it. So coming back to Lisp here. So here's the other two great programming language conceptions of the 60s, Simula and Lisp. And Lisp was really early. McCarthy wrote some of his first stuff about how to do this in '59. And actually, I brought one along. I won't admit how many of these I own. But what's wonderful is MIT Press still sells these. I don't know why, but there are other people besides me who buy them. But see, if you turn to page 13 here, Carl knows this page very well. Harvey knows this page very well. So this is like the entire world. This is like Maxwell's equations here. It's one of the greatest things anybody ever did for us, because it's not just doing a Turing machine. They were around for a long time. The thing that's cool about this is a Turing machine that has slope, in that you can get from here to where you want to go very, very rapidly. And actually, this is a fun thing about being part of an art, because as I was talking about this, I could feel chills going up and down my spine right now, because this is real power, intellectual power. And realized that if you could take what was great about Lisp and add this biological, ecological way of doing things to it, you'd have something pretty darn interesting. And so the second crossroads was kind of taking this flex machine, which is not very Lisp-like, and adding some Lisp and logo ideas to it to get a children's language that adults could program in as well. And because we like to build hardware at Xerox PARC, we got a new machine and then a whole bunch of stuff done there just all of a sudden. All kinds of things. And what's germane to this talk is that we had lots of different hardware architectures. We just like to build computers. They all had different CPUs on them. And Smalltalk ran on all of them bit identical. So it wasn't the way some systems are today. We wrote a book about it. But when commercialization happened, things started degenerating. Entropy set in. Here's an example. So this is one of the most respected Java developers. And in this book, he actually says that any seasoned Java programmer will quickly note that write once, run everywhere is a myth along the lines of Paul Bunyan. Now, it happens to be true. But it is unbelievable to me that they would be so complacent about it to actually write it down. Because isn't Java supposed to be compatible on all of the systems on the internet? So this is bad. So I claim that the architectures people are dealing with today are basically 60s mainframe hardware and software. If you look at Intel and Motorola, they've never really gotten, I mean, Intel started off as a pocket calculator and never got beyond that much. Motorola started out as a kind of a PDP-11. Very early architectures, and then very typical 60s software as done before 1965. Bad operating systems, layers, applications, and a whole bunch of stuff. And then grafted onto that today are some things from ARPA and PARC, like TCP/IP, PostScript, laser printing, more expandable architectures. And so about 3 years ago, we got really, really upset about all this, as we had decided that we were going to do some major new stuff with children. We wanted to do it on the internet. And our first thought is, well, we'll do this stuff on top of the Java VM. because everybody's implementing it like mad and it's going to be on everything. And we looked at it and we thought, wait a minute, this is no good. You can't do this. It's not reflective. It doesn't have any of these things. So we finally said, let's just go back and revive what we had at Xerox PARC, but revive a 90s version of it. So that's what Squeak is. We call it Squeak instead of Smalltalk because Smalltalk now has the tinges of the various commercial versions. And what we had at Xerox PARC was not very much like the commercial versions ever. Now, so a way of thinking about Squeak is it's just a sea of objects here. And what we've tried to do is make it a kind of a world. And so there's an authoring level for 5-year-old kids like Huey. There's an authoring level for Donald. There's one for gyro gear looses, of which there are a lot here at MIT. And because every line of code in the system is available, including the stuff in the bottommost level, there's some stuff for Albert Einstein to do here as well. And though I'm giving you this talk and demo on a Macintosh, there's no Macintosh code running on this machine right now, and there hasn't been from the time I started. There's nothing. This thing is its own operating system, just like we were talking about. And it can be started up from all of these different platforms, including a couple of bare chips. Okay, so just to show you a couple of things. Now, why am I showing you all this stuff? Well, the reason I'm showing you this is because this system is free. I'm going to explain this a bit. You can get it tonight from the internet. It's been free for the last several years. And it's not a Disney product. It's something that we started at Apple to have a tool of our own that would be up to our standards again. And we decided to put it out on the internet just for people to use if they would like to get free of the sort of the software paralysis that's affecting everyone. And we'll take a look and see how large it is. But let me show you a couple of things. How many people here use Microsoft Word? Okay. So if you notice that it takes longer to get a document up on the screen now than it used to 5 years ago. In fact, it takes a lot longer to get a document up on the screen now than it did 10 years ago. So Nicholas Negroponte's phrase for this is, Andy giveth, but Bill taketh away. So we thought Moore's law was irresistible, but Microsoft found a way of damping it. So what I'm going to do here is bring up my Scientific American article of a few years ago right now. That's how long it takes in this system. And everything is editable here. And in fact, this is a whole environment for making this document. If I drop the... It's more than just a text editor. It's actually kind of a desktop publishing system. In fact, descended from the original desktop publishing system. And in fact, if I drop a palette in, it makes me a kind of an onion skin in case I want to trace something. The simplest thing to do in a little demo like this is to just make a corporate logo. This is a little more difficult than it was when we were at Apple. And again, this thing that I made is felt by the text. And the other thing to realize about this is not an application, because applications are an old bad idea. If you have an object-oriented system, what you basically want to do is to gather all the resources you need and make what you want. So for instance, I can just drag this piece of text out of here, and if I start shoving this up, it will start rolling along. And if I go to the next page here and start shoving this, right, so everything's kind of alive here. And now if I go back to where we were, notice that this thumbnail has felt the changes I made. In fact, this is the original Xerox PARC interface, which is not really a desktop interface. It was an interface of many desks. The idea is that any child or adult usually has 3 or 4 projects they want to work on over time, maybe a few hours a day. And today's user interfaces, which are kind of bad caricatures of what we did at PARC, are interfaces that force you to build up a lot of windows, then take them down, and build up a lot of windows and take them down. Whereas this interface just gives you a new desk for every project, and you can have hundreds of them. Let me go over to here and take a look at a project for a 10-year-old, which might be kind of a Montessori project of getting the 10-year-old to make a car and learn how to drive it, and to see if we can get the 10-year-old to learn something cool about math without realizing it. So we tell the kid to draw the car from the top, maybe put in some specular reflection, because this is Disney. A little bit of Hollywood. And maybe make it into a dune buggy with some tires. And then you say, okay, that's good enough. Then what the system does is makes it into an object right away that I can do something with. So I'll make it the size I want it. And for free, it's given me a symbolic rendering of this, basically the object's interface over here in a form the kids can understand. So when I take the blue handle and rotate the car, you can see the property called heading over here going positive in that direction and negative in that direction. And if I come over here and start pressing on the caret, it'll rotate the car there. Now, first thing we encourage the kid to do is to rename the thing car. Try some behaviors. Car forward, we press on the exclamation point. Car turn. And then the magic happens when we say just pull out some of those behaviors and start them ticking. Okay, and so now we can play with these things. Now, notice that we have concrete numbers here. That's good because the kid's in that phase of thinking, but we give them the whole set, so they can just use the carets there to speed the car up. And I can change what happens when it bounces. Now I'm going to slow it down here. Of course, the kids will play at this for a long time. But the next thing we want the kids to do is to think about steering this car. And we notice that if we go to 0, the car will go straight. If we go positively, the car will go in that direction. If we go negatively, it will go in this direction. So that's kind of a clue as to how we might make a steerable car. So what we do is we tell the kids, okay, just make yourself a steering wheel. Just make this smaller. And just to keep it straight for the audience here, I'll go up and name it steer. So the thing that get the kid noticing is that, yeah, if we rotate this, the heading changes. Go in the other direction, it goes to minus numbers, and that's kind of what turn was doing down here. So what would happen if we just picked up the name of the angle that the steering wheel is set and just put it in there, and then would we be able to steer the car? Yeah. And the kids say, wow, this is great, but it's too jerky. Yeah, we say, yeah, you made a race car, so it doesn't have any gears. And they say, well, what do you mean gears? And well, your parents' car has gears. So now is an interesting place for the kid, because 10-year-old kids, if you think about it, have never had a reason in their entire life to ever learn what multiplication and division are good for. And they are the equivalents of gears. So see this little caret over here. If I press on this, it will extend out the expression here. I can click on the operators, not minus, not times. How about dividing by 3 here? And now if I steer the car, I have to turn the steering wheel 3 times as far in order to control it, and I've inserted a gear between the steering wheel and the thing. So I think you get the idea. So this is kind of Seymour Papert's turtle graphics combined with object-oriented programming, and a way of dealing with what the system can do that gives the kids a payoff here, but gets them to notice interesting symbolic things about mathematical parts of this. So when we asked the kids what was the part of this project that they liked the most, they said, learning to drive the car. We asked them, what was the hardest part of this project? And they said, learning to drive the car. The fact that they'd spent 15 minutes programming completely passed them by, because in fact, most kids are not interested in programming. In fact, most kids are only interested in things that give them direct payoffs in the world that they live in. I'll just show you a couple more here. This is a whole family of things. Here's one that a 5-year-old did. Mommy, what's hiding in the grass? I don't know. Look at this. This is fun. They love these little camouflage games, and they're learning this very simple little differential equation there at 5. Here's one for symmetry. Let's make the top rectangle appear to get larger. Okay, and it's a one-line program here where they learn what -1 is good for. So you get the idea here, I think. Now let me go to another little more serious thing. But again, we start off with fun, dealing with particles. And the first thing we say is, why does your bicycle tire get hot when you blow it up? Well, that's why. Why does your soda pop get cold when you open it? That's why. But then what we want them to think about is, let's try doing an infection here. Let's learn about something complicated. So let's turn everybody to blue except one red one. We'll let them infect each other. Then we can get the history of this infection. It looks kind of like this. And then let's try this on something like, that was like AIDS. Let's try this on something like typhoid here. Infection history is like that. Now here comes the serious part of this, is it happens that human imagination is roughly like this. It's like a little keyhole. If you look at an AIDS epidemic, when it's starting off, when you can do something about it, it actually doesn't look like anything wrong is happening. It has a long time constant. If you've been following the papers, you probably know that 28 million people are HIV positive in Africa alone now, and almost all of them are going to die. Many countries in Africa are 25% HIV positive. Now, why there and not here? The answer is here, every scientist and mathematician, when AIDS was heard about, knew what was going to happen, because even though our brains are terrible at exponential curves, by learning math and learning these new ways of thinking about it, we can guarantee that something that has these characteristics is going to be a disaster down the road, and there was enough beating. The politicians didn't want to do anything. because it really didn't look that bad. The difference in Africa and in the Pacific Rim is that there's nobody to beat on the politicians. They've ignored it and ignored it and ignored it, and all of a sudden it is now seriously bad. Now, the reason we're doing all this stuff is because this is the kind of stuff that Seymour was talking about. We want to better inform and better shape the common sense of kids, not just what they've learned how to do. I'll show you one more thing here. It's kind of cute. So here's a movie. Here's some music. So if I play it, remember that? So here's let me just tell you what's going on here. So again, this is not QuickTime, this is Squeak time. And one of the things that we did at PARC that we really enjoyed was to make use of the fact that every computer can be a high-quality synthesizer, something that has been forgotten in the commercialization. So there's actually no sound card or anything in here. This is just the equivalent of a Proteus-level stereo synthesizer in the software of the Squeak VM. Now let me show you how we use the thing. What I was playing you is not exactly the way Disney did it. So I'm going to play this thing backwards. I'm going to find this place where it cuts to the top, right there. And I'm going to pull out a thumbnail of that. And I'm going to rewind the score. I'm just going to play through. Then I'm going to drop the thumbnails in where the Disney sync points were put. Okay, it happens that right on this little inverted trill here is where the Disney animators long ago decided to cut to the top of the mountain. So on this note in the trombones is where his right wing goes up to the top. Here's where his left wing goes up to the top. So it happens that he actually puts his hands down right on this lowest note, not before then when they did. So now if we rewind and play. So now what it's doing is calculating how to sample out the movie to get the cut points right. Okay, so you get the idea. So there's a lot of things you can... Now, important thing to realize that these are not features. These are just programs. There's a lot of things that can be done here. So here's the very same... So this is a Buxtehude organ piece. wind it. Now I can orchestrate this thing in various ways. What I'm going to do is edit the synthetic timbre in here while it's playing. Okay. So let me wind up. Lots more interesting things here. So let's go back to our E. coli for a second. And let's ask Squeak some questions. For instance, how many types of things, Squeak, do you have? Oh, 1,917 classes. How many things do you have in you that are like subroutines? 16,000 something. These are questions of the system, what you call the operating system, all of the things you would call applications, all the things I've shown you, a browser, a chat interface, and a whole bunch of other things. How many bytes of code do you have, Mr. Squeak, in you? Oh, 936K bytes. So it's actually rather large by Xerox PARC standards, because we wouldn't have been able to run this on our little 256K machines back then. But in fact, so I'm trying to make a point here, which is, let's ask it how many objects there are. About 642,000 objects. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the actual information content of most software today is abysmally low, monstrously low. With a better architecture, you can get a ton of stuff without even worrying. And here's the other interesting thing is this is the entire group that made Squeak in less than 3 years. Here we were back last January, and these 4 guys here did virtually all of the work. We put it out on the web in September '96, and here we are, November 2nd, demo to MIT. So we're just coming up on the 3rd year of development. That's worthwhile pondering, that you can do all of that stuff with just 4 people. I know there's more than 4 people at MIT because I can see the... So, architecture and scaffolding. Meta-object protocol, well, we don't do it quite the way Gregor and Danny do. But let me just show you how we made the system. So we went to the book we wrote and actually took an old Smalltalk. We typed the code for the VM that we'd written in this book, which nobody has ever read, into this Smalltalk system to make a simulator of what the virtual machine should be. Then we wrote a translator of the simulator, and then we used that to make ourselves a new VM that did not have any of this old Smalltalk in it, and then we moved over the image, which has all of the objects in it, and now we were completely free. That took about a month and a half or so to do, and all of a sudden we had a completely machine-independent version of Squeak. And all of these different ports have been to take this guy and first improve it. Like when we put in the music, you do the programming of the VM by making the simulator do what you want, and then getting this translator to make you a new VM, so you never write any C code by hand. And the ports are all done by simply diverting the simulation translator to different target machines. So all the ports, in fact, were done in less than 2 weeks by people we'd never met before that just found this on the internet and did it. The last part of it is this whole worldwide community is held together by synchronized code. So at any point in time, I can I'm not connected, but I can say update code from server, and if I say Disney internal updates or Squeak public updates, it will go out automatically to the nearest mirror server and find the latest updates and serialize them in. So this system has not been built from source listings since about 1975. It's never been stopped. It's kind of important to think about. And here's the URL. So everything in this demo was built from this. The versions you'll find there, and you'll find all of the ports. And we offer it to all of you, not in the spirit of competition with anybody else, because it's hard enough to do one's own work, but in the spirit of trying to get more and better ideas out into the world so we can get better at doing software. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time to take one or two questions.
Sure.
It's a bit late, so people who want to leave can leave, but Alan is willing to stay and answer questions. So we'll take a 30-second pause, and then who wants to fire the first question? Yes. All right.
Should I wait?
Yeah, wait. 15 seconds. Okay. Fantastic.
Great. Well, it's just what I showed you on the plane, right?
No.
Is this my personal work environment, and what have I done to migrate, what have we done to migrate stuff out in the world into this? So the answer to the first question is about 95% now. One of our fears when we started this at Apple was that circumstances might someday force us to buy a non-Mac. And we knew for sure we were never going to run under Windows. So part of the goal, was to get fairly self-sufficient. The migration, basically, since we did it for ourselves, this is not a product, and it's not intending to compete with Java or anything else. You could think of it as an intellectual toy, except it's the best kind. It's like a really good pipe organ. Which is basically a toy. You play on it. But the idea is you should be able to play the best music that was ever written on it. There's no interest, for instance, in migrating something like Photoshop to it, even if we wanted to. So basically, one of the problems when you do a system like this is I have a nice slide set which is the 6 reasons why you should not do a system like this. And one of them is getting back to 0. And of course, the 0 is not the 0 that the world was at when you start. It's the 0 the world is at by the time you get done. Another one of the reasons is these systems tend not to get done, right? But so what we had to do when we started the thing in January '96, our aim was by January '99 to have something that had all of the things that we thought we needed for day-to-day stuff, plus some special things that nobody else had. That was our goal. And we're pretty much there. There's just one, I would say it's, in the sense that there are 4 authoring environments. We are, and each one of them has a user interface on it. We are 7/8 there, and the functionality that we were hoping for is pretty much completely there, and 3 out of the 4 authoring environments are fully functional. The last one, which is the Donald one, which is the hardest absolutely hardest one because you're dealing with adults who don't want to be the same as professional programmers but have big ideas. That's the hard one. And that one will, I think, will be at some sort of reasonable place by when we thought, but I believe it will be tinkering on that one for the rest of '99, just because it's a hard one to do. So it's, on the other hand, it's also made in this gyro level that anytime we wanted something, for instance, we had a nice summer intern from Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech is teaching this in all of its programming courses because the nice thing about it is you can drill down into it. If you want to see how the compiler works, it's there. If you want to see how the, I mean, if you want to, this is kind of cute. If you go into the quantum authoring here, you want to see, look at the interpreter and see how it does a primitive add. You can look at that. If you want to see what the interpreter simulator does, you can look at it because it's just all there. So in a computer science course, even an early one, you can start off with fairly simple stuff, but if a question comes up, you can just drill down and say, yeah, here's how this piece of quantum mechanics works down at the bottom here, and let's change it and see what happens. So that's basically what it's for, and one of our slogans is the system should be the curriculum. So the idea is that things in books don't actually help much in this domain. This harks back to the way Marvin used to teach incoming graduate students programming. He used to give them the previous year's PhD thesis in Lisp. And so they had this big, huge piece of more or less working Lisp code. But the nice thing about it is they didn't have to worry about the syntax that much and a whole bunch of other things that had already been structured by people who could program. And the same thing with learning any complex system. I don't think you want to learn algorithms first because it gets you in the wrong frame of mind for everything else you're going to do later. So by the way, while the thing was playing all that music and showing the movies and stuff like that, there was a real-time garbage collector running. This is a completely garbage collected system. And I had the pleasure a few days ago at the University of Maryland, after a vociferous discussion about why Java is no good because it has a garbage collector, of getting up and showing that it wasn't the existence of a garbage collector that was the problem. It's the fact that the garbage collector in Java is not very good. And many people are sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Right? They somehow assume that there's something special about the people programming Java, and therefore, if their garbage collector is too slow, then there must be something wrong with using a garbage collector. Yeah. So the answer is we had this kid from Georgia Tech, and just in the summer, in a couple of months, he did an internet browser, an email, POP3 email client, and a chat client. Because they're in there. And it was just one kid for about 7 weeks to do it. So it's, for a lot of things, it's relatively easy to do stuff. I mean, there's a real-time FFT in there. There's all kinds. There's a wavelet transform in there. There's a whole bunch of things in there, again, all in this programmable form. So a person could do, I think, quite a bit of what Photoshop does without too much trouble. And then if it runs too slowly in the upper level, you just turn the translator on it and turn it into part of the VM.
Let's take one or two more quickly.
Yeah.
In the back there. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I thought
there's somebody.
I'll ask a question, sure.
Yeah.
Do you have any innovative ideas on how to combine functionality in a synthetic way? It's easy to move data around with abstractions, but when you want to have some kind of emergent behavior in the function that occurs, it gets a little trickier.
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, one of the, it's always hard to give any reasonable account of the different streams that fed into the development of OOP. But I think one of the things that any programmer would like is at any level of a system they're working on to be able to add new stuff as though it were linear. right? I mean, this is, and of course, it almost never works out that way. So, for example, so this is the opposite of what you're talking about. What you would like is where you're adding stuff whose intention is to be nonlinear, and it's not going to bite you, right? So I think that is very difficult, although Sketchpad is the closest thing to do it, because it basically said, I'm only going to do things that I have criteria for. And so in essence, it was solving a series of nonlinear equations to determine what its behavior was. On the other hand, even though when it was doing it successfully, it sometimes surprised people because it was not clear to the person putting in the new knowledge exactly what all the ramifications of the new knowledge were going to be, even if everything went well. So I think this is a very difficult, and you find it in lots of different areas. You find it in things like multiple inheritance, which various people have tried to find a way of getting synergy between the different inheritance streams in a way that makes sense. And some success has been had, but right now I think most people would agree that it's almost more trouble than it's worth. That it becomes kind of a hack rather than an algebraic kind of
Let's
thing.
take one last question. Ron Rivest.
It's like a wonderful system. I'm trying to think of a hard question to ask. So any system that tries to be comprehensive and deal with code that's easily shared and so on eventually has to deal with security issues. Could you say a few words about where your thinking is on security?
Yeah, well, actually, we've thought about that quite a bit. And so my theory about security is it's very similar to locks in that you can make great locks, but somebody with enough resources can get through the lock. And so basically, I think what locks are for are to discourage various grades of criminal.
You've got places to attach locks?
Yeah. Yeah. And in particular, these things that I was showing as projects, these kind of desktops, are actually independent modules because they're designed to be things that you might wander into on the internet. And so they actually have a certain security to them. And then there's an interesting question of how you can run them safely when you bring them into your machine. And so I think maybe the only thing I can add to mechanisms that everybody are familiar with, because there's any number of ways of doing things, including one of the things that we ran with at Apple successfully for many years was simply confining, making it impossible for the system to write to the disk in unrestricted ways, confining other kinds of things. However, this is since you asked the question, I have a prejudice about how it should be done, which is orthogonal but synergistic with encryption ideas. But it's basically that on every machine, like on this machine, although Apple doesn't use it, there is a memory management unit. And it's not used very well on Windows either. And so if you think about the general problem of dealing with the internet, where you're out there, you see something that looks like it might be useful, and let's say it's an object. The probability it's going to be your favorite kind of object, like a Squeak object, is low, or any other kind of object. And so, but if it's really an object, it should communicate with other objects not of its species. Right? Because otherwise, what use is having an object? You really don't have an object if they can't send messages to, like if a Squeak object can't send messages to a Java object, it's not very object-oriented, and neither is Java. So if you get this notion that the objects are kind of recapitulating all the heterogeneity of hardware on the network and using TCP/IP for sending messages back and forth, then the question is if I have to bring an object in order to run it in a reasonable way, how should I do it? I believe the answer is you stick that object in a separate address space. And if it needs to bring in its handler, you let it bring in its handler into that separate address space. And you run that object and any other objects in that special address space. And you monitor the traffic between that address space and the other parts of the system. That is the way I would like to do it. Because all other ways are, and you can encrypt wherever you want. But to me, what you really want to do is be able to enforce what a set of things that you're not quite sure what they are can do, but still let them run. So this is what you might call a constitutional approach to the problem, where you don't want to tell the objects what to do, but you want to make sure they can't do a lot of damage.
I think we must stop, otherwise Alan is going to miss his plane to Chicago. This is the most fascinating talk I have heard in a long, long time. Okay.